Let's create a PipeGears application that gets user data from a database and provides access to it via a simple REST API. We'll start by dragging this SQL data source node onto the canvas and configuring it. I set up my host first. Now this is an external database. Database name, user, and password. I'm going to create a label for this so I can refer to it later on. And in my case I've used MariaDB, but you could also use MySQL, Postgres, or MS SQL Server. Alright, we're done here. I'm going to save this. And now I can actually create the endpoint itself. I'm going to start by dragging this web service gear onto the canvas and configuring that. Now each time I create an endpoint, I have a host name that's dynamically generated for me. Now this is the same host name that would be used for all endpoints within this one application. Now each endpoint can have their own specific path, and in this case I'm going to name this one /API/users. So any request now to this host /API/users will trigger this flow that I'm creating right now. All right, let's save this. Now when a request comes in here, we're going to send that to this gear here, which will actually do an SQL query to the data source that we've just created. And I refer to that by selecting my label that I created before when I was configuring the data source and typing out a simple SQL query. So in this case I'll just do a very simple select star from users just for the sake of this example, and save that. Now what's going to happen here is when a query comes into this endpoint, it's going to be dispatched to this SQL query gear, which will issue the query, and then the resulting data or the result set will be passed on to any subsequent gear here. Now for the sake of this example, I just pre-populated a database with some simple user information that I'm using here. Alright, now there are two possible outputs from this SQL query node, a success path and a failure path. So that allows me the ability to do error handling and have a different response for an error when I'm accessing my data. Now let's do the success path first by dragging this web reply gear onto the canvas. So we need to reply to the initial query that was issued. In the event of a success, we want to respond just with the result that's contained in the result set. Now this web reply gear allows me to specify any header that I need when I do my web response. And I've already created a content type here called application/JSON, and I've set up an access control allow origin star, so this allows access from any host, which is sometimes used when you're creating an API. Now in the response body, I just want the result set, so I'm going to type $, and this opens up a drop down that gives me access to all of the attributes, all of the variables that were provided or pre-populated by the upstream gears that have already executed in that flow. So I have the SQL.result.json variable here, which is what I want, and this is actually the one that contains the results of the data in the result set. All right, let's save that. And for my failure path, if I want to, assuming the query doesn't work, then I want to respond just with an error message to the API user. So in this case, I will just do SQL error message, which is also available and provided by the upstream gear here, the SQL query gear. Alright, let's start this and see what happens. To actually execute this flow, I can just quickly click this arrow button here, and this is going to have the same effect as if someone were to come in on that URL and issue a query. So let's see what happens here. I just issued the query and I got my response, which is the JSON formatted result set from that table that I showed you earlier. Alright, so that's it. I have a basic API or an endpoint here that I can use to provide data into a table for a client. Now I'm going to go one step further and actually show you what it would look like if a client were to use this API. And I can actually do that within this PipeGears application here as well. I'll just create a second endpoint or a second path that I can access. Let's just call this one /users. And in this one, I'm just going to simply send a reply, which is going to be a web template, an HTML template that will actually invoke this initial REST API that I created. Right. So in this case, I'm going to do text/HTML as the content type, and I don't really need this access control header anymore, so I'll just delete it. And for the body, I've actually created an HTML template that I want to use here. I'm using a simple template, which is just a table that shows all the attributes in that table that I've created. And in my particular case here, I'm using the Vue.js framework to keep things very simple. So when this page loads, what happens is I actually go to this server endpoint here, I access /API/users, I issue a query here, and I'm writing all the data that I receive into this users array, and then the template just unwraps that array into a table. Alright, let's select all of this, and we're going to go back to our PipeGears application, and I just need to paste this in the response body here. So ultimately what's going to happen is when a request comes into /users, I will be outputting this HTML back to the user, and then this within the browser will actually issue the second query that goes and gets the user data from the /API/users endpoint. Alright, let's just save this. Now I will restart the application, and I'll see what happens when we invoke this endpoint here. Let's just launch that, and you can see my template has been loaded into the browser. It's gone and issued the subsequent query to the API and unraveled this user data into my HTML table. So that's it. It's an example of creating a REST API, a basic REST API that gets data from an external data source and returns it in the form of JSON data. And then an example of a client. This might not necessarily be hosted within PipeGears. It could be hosted anywhere. It could just live within the browser as a rich client application. But this is an example of how someone might use a REST API like this. All right, and that's all. Thank you very much.